Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation here today to give this webinar. I look forward to sharing an introduction to individual participant data meta-analysis with you all. So an outline of what I'll be talking about today in this webinar. I'll be introducing what individual participant data or IPD meta-analysis is, when you might want to use this sort of technique and why this sort of technique can be very useful. And I'll really be concentrating on many of the practical aspects of conducting an IPD meta-analysis, particularly concentrating around the retrieval of data, the retrieval of IPD for meta-analysis, as such methods have changed in recent years within what I'm going to call an era of data transparency. And the final thing that I'll be talking about in this webinar towards the end is some advice on what to do if a subset of IPD cannot be retrieved for the meta-analysis. And I will be giving illustrative examples throughout the webinar from Cochrane Epilepsy IPD reviews, and also where I'm talking about methodological aspects, I'll be giving additional references wherever possible. So firstly, meta-analysis. This is a statistical technique for combining sources of quantitative or numerical evidence. I'll be talking about two different types of meta-analysis today in this webinar. So firstly, pairwise meta-analysis. This is the traditional type of meta-analysis that most of you are probably aware of, in which the evaluation of two interventions, or an intervention and control, maybe treatment and placebo, which have been compared head-to-head in two or more clinical studies, and this data is pooled within meta-analysis. Then also I'll be talking about network meta-analysis, which allows the evaluation of more than two interventions, or multiple interventions, multiple controls, which have been compared head-to-head in two or more clinical studies. And this technique allows indirect evaluation of interventions which may not have been compared head-to-head within any clinical studies. So this technique can also help provide with an estimate of the relative effectiveness of all interventions within a network, even if they haven't been compared head-to-head in clinical studies. So this is very helpful for medical decision making. Traditionally, meta-analyses have been performed using aggregate data. And by aggregate data, I mean summary statistics such as mean differences, event counts, odds ratios, hazard ratios, risk ratios, and so on, which are extracted from published journal articles, conference abstracts, trial registries, and so on. So, for example, you may find a table that looks like this within a journal article. You can extract, for example, numbers of events. You may extract relative effect sizes, such in this case, hazard ratios to include within your meta-analysis. Also, more recent work has shown that unpublished documentation, such as study protocols, analysis plans, clinical study reports, can also be a very useful resource for aggregate data to include within meta-analysis. The alternative approach to meta-analysis is using individual patient or participant data, so IPD, within analysis. So here we have a very simple data set that I've made up, which has got a patient ID number, their treatment allocation, some outcome information. So here we're looking at whether patients withdrew from their treatment or completed the study, and also some demographic information such as age and gender. So this is the original line-by-line participant level data is requested and can be completely reanalyzed. And this approach is widely considered to be the gold standard approach to meta-analysis, as there are many advantages to such an approach. And these advantages really are that this approach allows a more flexible and complex approach to analysis, such as outcomes can be standardized or perhaps redefined within meta-analysis. Participants who may have been excluded, perhaps due to protocol violations, can be reinstated in analysis. And theoretically, such an approach should result in reduced publication and reporting bias, as unpublished information can be included, and also reduced ecological bias in the effect size within a group may not necessarily reflect the effect sizes of individuals. For example, the treatment effect for a group of people with an average age of 50 may not necessarily reflect the treatment effect size for an individual person of the age of 50. Such an approach also allows any detailed checks that could be made of analysis assumptions, such as whether data is normally distributed, perhaps proportional hazards checks for survival data. And such an approach also allows more complicated, more complex statistical analysis approaches, such as modelling heterogeneity within or between studies, considering covariates in analysis or treatment covariate interactions, or also modelling more complex data types, such as prognostic or diagnostic data. An IPD approach actually may be the only option for meta-analysis where summary data is not available, so where the summary statistics that are needed for meta-analysis are not reported in the published literature. So a good example of this is that previous work in oncology and cancer has shown that time to event or survival statistics generally aren't well reported within the published literature. Particularly hazard ratios and measures of precision required for meta-analysis, such as confidence intervals, standard errors, and so on, are rarely reported. And the first work in this area was done by the great Doug Altman in 1995, and there has been more recent work over the last 20 years showing that actually, even over time, this hasn't really improved. So an IPD approach is particularly considered to be gold standard where time to event outcomes are of interest. So an IPD approach to meta-analysis is becoming more and more popular. As this graph shows, going back to the 1980s, 1990s, forward into 2015, the number of IPD meta-analyses being published each year is greatly increasing. And it's actually increased to an average of 105 IPD meta-analyses being published per year from 2009 up to August 2015. So even though an IPD approach to meta-analysis is increasing and becoming more popular, it's actually still only used in a very small minority in around 5% of published meta-analyses. The rest still use aggregate data. But why is this? IPD is considered to be a gold standard approach. There's so many advantages to using this type of approach to meta-analysis. Well, the simple answer to this is that IPD meta-analyses are very hard work. Multidisciplinary teams with statistical expertise are required to do this sort of work. It can be very resource intensive and costly to put together these sorts of teams. This sort of work is also very time consuming. And as I talk through some of the examples of IPD meta-analyses that I've worked in epilepsy, I'll try and highlight some of the dates to show how long some of these projects did take. IPD meta-analysis is also open to availability bias, where a subset of IPD is not available, and I'll be talking about that later on within the webinar. Furthermore, if an aggregate data approach can be shown to be mathematically equivalent to an IPD approach, and the adequate aggregate data required is available, the resource and time savings that are associated with this kind of approach would make aggregate data the approach of choice over an IPD approach, even though IPD may be considered to be gold standard. So some considerations for the analysis approach that you should be using IPD or aggregate data. And I've posed two questions here to think about when conducting a review to guide which source of data may be more useful. So the clinical question or the objective of the review is the interest in the relative or absolute treatment effect only. So for example, calculating a pooled relative risk or a pooled mean difference. Or perhaps there is interest in examining the effect in patient subgroups or the effect of different covariates. Maybe there's interest in modelling any variability or heterogeneity. Perhaps complex data types such as prognostic or diagnostic data is specifically of interest, or a specific type of complex statistical modelling approach would be needed for the review. Also thinking about the outcomes of interest. Are the outcome data actually likely to be reported? So for example, are time to event statistics of interest, as it is well documented that these sorts of outcomes aren't very well reported in the published literature. Also consider the definition of the outcome. Is it likely that all studies will define the outcome in the same way, or could there be any scope for differences or inconsistencies in the definition of the outcome across studies? So considering these different questions, generally, if the interest of or the objective of the review is only around calculating treatment effect, and the review is measuring a consistently defined outcome, and outcome data is likely to be reported in the published literature, then an aggregate data approach could be a feasible approach for this type of review. However, if anything more complex in the clinical question or the objective and the analysis approach is required, or if there are any concerns regarding the definition of the outcomes or whether outcomes are likely to be reported or not, then an IPD approach is likely to be required in these scenarios.